I stood in the church parking lot at my grandson's funeral, watching my daughter-in-law hand out programs like she was hosting a dinner party, and I already knew what was coming before she ever opened her mouth. I just didn't know it would happen in front of 40 people, over a casket that was far too small. My name is Robert Hayes. I am 71 years old. Before I tell you what happened at that reception, you need to understand how a man loses everything twice in one lifetime, because none of it happened the way anyone expected, least of all me. If you believe family should mean something, even when it's tested by grief, stay with me until the end, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now, let me take you back to where this really started. I bought my house on Maple Crest Drive in Columbus, Ohio, in 1979. I was 24 years old then, fresh out of the Army, working construction during the day and taking night classes at the community college 3 times a week. My wife Eleanor was expecting our daughter Susan at the time, and we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. But we had that plot of land and a bank loan nobody thought we'd pay off in under 30 years. We paid it off in 19. Eleanor chose every fixture in that kitchen herself, standing in the aisle at the hardware store for 2 hours, deciding on cabinet handles like the fate of the world depended on it. I poured the concrete for the driveway myself over one brutal August, working weekends until my hands blistered and healed and blistered again. We raised Susan in that house. We watched her go off to Ohio State, watched her come home with a philosophy degree neither of us understood the use of, and watched her eventually marry a good, quiet man named Peter who worked in logistics for a shipping company downtown. Eleanor died 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late to do much of anything about it. I was 65 years old and suddenly alone in a 4-bedroom house that had once been so loud with life it practically hummed, and now sat so quiet I could hear the refrigerator cycle on and off from the living room. Susan worried about me rattling around in that house by myself, and I understood her worry, even if I didn't love the feeling of being worried about. So when she and Peter told me they wanted to move in with their son Caleb, my only grandson, to help keep an eye on me in my older years, I welcomed it, like a man welcomes rain after a drought. I thought it was love. I thought my daughter was doing right by her old man, and in a way she was. It was her husband's mother, Denise, who came along with an entirely different set of intentions, and I didn't see it coming because I wasn't looking for it. I had no reason to be suspicious of my own son-in-law's family. I gave Denise a key to my house the same week she started staying with us to help with Caleb during the day. I never imagined that key would end up being used against me. Denise was 58 years old, a widow herself, sharp-tongued, but charming in the way some people are charming, only when it benefits them. She volunteered at her church twice a month and made sure everyone at Sunday service knew about it. At family dinners, she complimented my cooking and asked about my knees, and brought over casseroles wrapped in tin foil with her name written on masking tape. But underneath all that southern hospitality dressed up in a Midwestern accent, something else was working, quiet and patient, like water finding a crack in a foundation. Within the first year of her staying with us more and more, helping with little Caleb while Susan and Peter worked, I noticed she'd started referring to the house differently. Not your house, Robert, but the house, like it was a piece of property up for grabs rather than the place I'd built with my own 2 hands over 4 decades. She asked Peter, more than once, in front of me, whether I had ever considered simplifying things. By putting the house in a trust with multiple names on it for tax purposes, she said. For peace of mind, she said. I let it go every time. It was easier to let it go than to make waves in a house that was supposed to be full of grandchildren and Sunday dinners, not property disputes. Peter worked long hours, managing freight schedules, and every evening he came home exhausted, caught between his mother's opinions and his father-in-law's patience, trying to keep the peace between two people who were, in theory, on the same side. I watched my son-in-law get quieter over the months. I never said a bad word about Denise to Susan or Peter, not once, because I could see they already had enough weight sitting on their shoulders, raising a toddler and working full-time jobs. But I noticed things. I noticed how Denise talked about my property taxes like they were her business to manage. I noticed how she asked me, casually, over coffee, whether Eleanor and I had ever done proper estate planning, and how her eyes lingered on my face, a beat too long, waiting for my answer. I noticed how she watched little Caleb play in the backyard and once said, almost to herself, "This really is a wonderful yard for a growing family," in a tone that made the hair on my arm stand up for reasons I couldn't fully explain at the time. I told myself I was being an overly suspicious old man, the way widowers sometimes get when the world feels less steady under their feet. I told myself my daughter was happy having the extra help, and that was enough reason to keep my mouth shut. I was wrong to stay quiet as long as I did, but I loved my daughter's peace of mind more than I trusted my own gut, and at the time, that felt like the responsible thing to do. About 5 months before everything changed, Peter came to me alone on a Sunday afternoon while Susan had taken Caleb to a birthday party across town and Denise was at her weekly bridge game. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where Susan used to do her algebra homework as a girl, and he had a look on his face I hadn't seen since the day he asked me for my daughter's hand in marriage. Nervous, in a way that made my stomach tighten before he even said a word. He set a thick manila envelope on the table between us and told me to keep it somewhere safe, somewhere his mother would never think to search. I asked him what was inside. He said, "Robert, I need you to trust me on this. If anything ever happens to me, I need you to open this before you do anything else, before you talk to anyone, before you sign anything." I remember trying to laugh it off, telling him he was being dramatic for a healthy 38-year-old man with a good job and a beautiful family. He didn't laugh with me. He just looked at me with an expression I'd never seen cross his face before. Something between fear and a kind of grim resolve. Like a man bracing for weather he could already feel coming. I took the envelope without opening it and locked it inside the old fireproof safe in my bedroom closet, the same safe where Eleanor used to keep our marriage license and Susan's birth certificate. I didn't press him for more that day because Peter looked like a man who'd already made peace with a difficult decision, and I trusted him enough not to make him say it out loud before he was ready. Looking back now, I wonder just how much he already suspected. I wonder how long he'd been quietly building a case, protecting all of us without ever once alarming anybody. That envelope sat untouched in my closet for 5 months, and I had no idea it would end up being the only thing standing between me and losing everything I had left. It was a rainy Thursday evening in September when the call came that split my life into a before and an after. Peter had picked Caleb up from daycare and was driving them both home on Route 33 when a delivery truck ran a stop sign and struck the passenger side of his car, the side where my 4-year-old grandson was buckled into his car seat. The paramedics told us later that Peter died at the scene, trying to shield him. Caleb survived the crash itself, but complications in the hospital took him 3 days later. 3 days that Susan and I spent sitting in a pediatric ICU waiting room, drinking bad coffee and praying to a God I wasn't entirely sure was listening anymore. I remember standing in that hospital hallway when the doctor came out the final time, unable to speak, unable to fully process that I was about to bury my son-in-law and my only grandchild within the same week. Denise was in that waiting room too, and I remember her face going white as paper when the doctor delivered the news, her hands trembling as she gripped the arm of a plastic chair. For one brief moment, I saw what looked like real human grief on her face, and it made me feel less alone in a hallway that suddenly felt enormous and cold. The days after that are still mostly fog to me, even now. Phone calls to 2 different funeral homes, choosing a small casket, which is a task I would not wish on any human being alive. Calling relatives in 4 different states to deliver news that broke something in every single one of them, the same way it had broken something in me. Denise handled a great deal of the arrangements, and at the time I was grateful for it, because Susan could barely stand upright most days, let alone make decisions about flower arrangements and burial plots. I kept catching myself listening for Caleb's little feet running down the hallway before I remembered. I kept setting an extra plate at dinner for a boy who used to insist on sitting next to Grandpa Robert every single night. Losing Eleanor had nearly broken me. Losing my son-in-law and my grandson within the same 72 hours felt like losing the last living proof that our family's future was ever going to continue past me. I sat in Caleb's little bedroom one night, surrounded by dinosaur sheets and a nightlight shaped like the moon, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a boy myself. I had no idea that within a week, the woman who had been organizing casseroles and funeral flowers would stand in that same house and tell a grieving old man to get out. The double funeral was held on a gray Saturday morning at Grace Lutheran, the same church 3 streets over where Susan had been baptized 41 years earlier, and where Caleb himself had been baptized just 3 years before. Nearly 90 people came. Peter's coworkers from the shipping company, Susan's college roommates, neighbors who had watched Caleb learn to ride his bike up and down our street just that past summer. I stood near the front between 2 caskets, one adult-sized and one heartbreakingly small, shaking hands and accepting hugs from people whose names I could barely remember through the haze of grief. Denise stood near me through most of the service, dressed head to toe in black, playing the role of grieving mother and grandmother with what I now understand was practiced precision. After the burial, everyone gathered back at my house for the reception, the same tradition our family had always followed, the same tradition we'd followed when we buried Eleanor 6 years before. I was sitting in my recliner in the living room, still in my funeral suit, staring at a plate of food someone had handed me that I had no intention of eating, when Denise crossed the room and knelt down close beside my chair. The living room was full, maybe 35 or 40 people standing around holding paper cups of coffee and speaking in the hushed tones people use at funerals, that careful, muffled murmur meant to respect the dead. Denise leaned in close to my ear, close enough that her voice carried further than she probably intended, or maybe exactly as far as she intended, and said, "This grieving isn't good for you, Robert. It's time you thought about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to manage. This house is too much house now. I've already spoken to a facility in Westerville. You have 30 days." The room went dead silent. I saw my neighbor of nearly 25 years, a retired firefighter named Gerald Ochoa, freeze mid-sip with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. I saw Susan's college roommate, Monica, cover her mouth in visible shock from across the room. Every single person standing in that living room heard what Denise said to me on the day we buried my son-in-law and my grandson, in the house I had built with my own 2 hands over 4 decades of my life. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her in front of everyone I had ever known. I looked at Denise for a long, quiet moment, and something inside my chest went completely still, the way a pond goes still and glassy in the hour just before the first frost sets in. I thought about Peter, about the envelope locked away in my closet, about the 5 months I'd spent trusting my son-in-law's instincts without demanding a single explanation. I thought about 40 years of memories under that roof, about Eleanor's cabinet handles and the driveway I'd poured with blistered hands the summer before Susan was born. Then I looked at Denise, and I said very calmly, very evenly, "You've mistaken my silence for weakness for the last time, Denise. But all right." That's all I said. 6 words and then 2 more, and I let the silence do the rest of the work for me. The room stayed frozen for several long seconds before people slowly, awkwardly returned to their hushed conversations, unsure exactly what they had just witnessed unfold in front of them. I stood up from that recliner, walked upstairs to my bedroom, and packed a single suitcase. I didn't take much. A few changes of clothes, my blood pressure medication, a framed photograph of Eleanor holding baby Susan on the porch steps back in 1980, and the fireproof safe from my closet with Peter's envelope still locked inside it. I came back downstairs 15 minutes later, suitcase in one hand, safe tucked under my other arm, and walked straight past Denise toward the front door without another word. She looked almost let down that I wasn't crying, wasn't begging, wasn't giving her the scene she'd clearly rehearsed for in her head beforehand. I gave her nothing at all. I opened my own front door, stepped out into the cool September evening, and walked 4 houses down the street without turning around once. Behind me, I could still hear the confused, low murmur of my own guests, wondering exactly what they had just watched happen to a man who had buried 2 family members in 1 week. Gerald Ochoa had been my neighbor for 25 years, ever since he and his wife Marion bought the house at the end of the cul-de-sac, back when our street still had dirt shoulders instead of sidewalks. He was 74 years old now, a retired firefighter who still power washed his own driveway every spring and helped every widow on the block shovel snow in the winter without ever being asked. He'd been at the funeral that day, and he'd heard every single word that came out of Denise's mouth. When he opened his front door and saw me standing on his porch, with a suitcase in one hand and a metal safe under my arm, he didn't ask a single question. He just stepped back and said, "Get in here, Robert, before you catch your death out there." His wife Marion had the guest room made up within the hour. Sheets pulled tight and a reading lamp switched on like she'd been expecting me. I sat at their kitchen table while Gerald poured 2 mugs of coffee and slid one across to me, settling into the chair across from mine with the weary patience of a man who'd spent 30 years running into burning buildings and had learned not to rush a person through their own fire. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. So I told him everything. The 30-day deadline, the way she'd delivered it in front of 40 grieving people, the way she'd looked almost satisfied handing that news to a man who'd just buried his grandson. Gerald shook his head slowly, jaw set tight with an anger he was holding back out of respect for the day. "That house is yours, Robert," he said. "Deed's been in your name alone since before Susan was even born. That woman has got no legal standing to put you out of anywhere, and you know that." I nodded, but my mind wasn't fully on the legal side of things yet. My mind was on that safe, sitting on the floor beside my chair, the one Peter had told me to open first if anything ever happened to him. That night, after Gerald and Marion had gone to bed, I sat alone at their kitchen table under a small reading lamp and finally opened the envelope. Inside were four things that changed the entire shape of what I understood to be true. The first was a certified copy of my property deed, confirming exactly what Gerald had already told me, that the house on Maple Crest Drive had never been transferred, shared, or amended in any way since Eleanor and I first signed for it in 1979. The second was a life insurance policy Peter had taken out through his employer 3 years earlier, worth $400,000. And 4 months before the accident, Peter had quietly added Susan and me as co beneficiaries, replacing a policy that had previously listed his mother Denise as the sole beneficiary from years before he'd even met Susan. The third item was a printed bank statement showing that Denise had, over the previous 18 months, borrowed a total of $47,000 from Peter under a series of small, undocumented loans she had never once repaid. Loans Peter had finally stopped agreeing to after discovering she'd forged his signature on a home equity application using his identity months earlier, an application that had thankfully been denied by the bank's fraud department before any money changed hands. The fourth item was a handwritten letter in Peter's own careful printing. In it, he explained that he'd discovered his mother had been quietly researching elder guardianship law in the state of Ohio, specifically the process for having an aging relative declared unable to manage their own affairs, and that he suspected she intended to eventually use that process against me in order to gain control of my property and assets. He wrote that he'd been documenting everything for months, terrified of being wrong about his own mother, but more terrified of being right and having done nothing to protect me. He asked me to forgive him for not telling me sooner, and he asked me, in his final written words to me, to protect myself, no matter how difficult that might be, no matter what it might cost our family to face the truth about Denise, out loud. I sat at that kitchen table and read my son-in-law's letter 3 times through, tears running freely down my face, not only from grief now, but from something else entirely, a hard, clear-eyed clarity settling into my chest like cold water. My son-in-law had seen this coming months before any of us. He had spent what turned out to be the final months of his life quietly building a wall between his mother and the father-in-law he'd come to love as his own family. The next morning, while I was still sitting at Gerald's kitchen table eating dry toast I could barely taste, Denise was already moving fast back at my house. A neighbor, 2 doors down, an older woman named Patricia Duval, who had lived on Maple Crest Drive even longer than I had, called Marion's phone around 9:30 that morning to say she'd seen an unfamiliar sedan parked in my driveway with a woman inside, taking photographs of the house from several angles. That same afternoon, I learned the woman had been a caseworker, and that Denise had filed an emergency petition with the Franklin County Probate Court requesting a guardianship hearing, claiming that I, Robert Hayes, was showing signs of dementia and self-neglect following the sudden trauma of losing both my son-in-law and grandson, and was therefore unfit to continue managing my own household and finances without court-appointed supervision. What she didn't know was that Peter's letter had already told me exactly what to watch for and exactly who to call the moment it happened. That same morning, I called an old family friend named Harold Whitfield, an elder law attorney who had practiced in Columbus for nearly 35 years and who had drawn up Eleanor's and my original will back when Susan was still in grade school. I told Harold everything, start to finish. The funeral, the 30-day ultimatum, the envelope, the strange caseworker sighting Patricia had reported. Harold told me to sit tight, and within 3 hours he called back with news that made the floor feel like it was tilting under me. He'd pulled the probate filing that morning, and Denise had submitted a petition supported by a letter from a physician I had never once met or been examined by, a doctor, Lawrence Fenn, claiming to have conducted a cognitive evaluation of me just 4 days earlier, the very same week I'd been sitting in a hospital hallway burying my grandson. The letter described symptoms of confusion and memory loss that had, according to the document, been observed during a supposed home visit, a visit that had never once taken place, because I had not left that house except for funeral arrangements the entire week in question. Harold Whitfield did not waste a single hour once he uncovered that letter. He'd been practicing elder law long enough to recognize exactly what he was looking at, a fabricated medical evaluation used as false evidence to support a fraudulent guardianship petition, a serious crime under Ohio law involving both fraud and potentially, elder abuse statutes carrying real criminal consequences. He looked up Dr. Fenn's medical license number listed on the letter and discovered the license had actually expired 11 months earlier, following a separate disciplinary suspension in a neighboring county, unrelated to me entirely, but more than enough to render the letter both fraudulent and legally worthless. Harold suspected, and within days confirmed through the state medical board, that Denise had paid Dr. Fenn, a distant acquaintance from her church directory, several $1,000s in cash to produce a fabricated evaluation without ever laying eyes on me. Harold sat me down and explained that this was no longer simply a difficult family disagreement. This was fraud upon a probate court, potential elder abuse, and identity-related forgery tied to the earlier home equity application. All serious felony matters under Ohio law. He asked me one plain question before doing anything further. Robert, do you want to try and handle this quietly within the family, or do you want this reported the way it deserves to be reported? I thought about Peter, about his letter in my hands, about how a decent, hardworking man had spent the final months of his life quietly protecting a father-in-law he loved enough to risk his own mother's fury. I thought about Denise kneeling beside my chair the day we buried my grandson, telling me I had 30 days before she'd have me shipped off to a facility in Westerville. I looked at Harold and said, "Report every bit of it." Harold filed a formal complaint with the Franklin County Probate Court's Fraud Division that same afternoon, along with copies of the fabricated medical letter, the expired license documentation, Denise's undocumented loan history, and Peter's original handwritten letter as supporting evidence of intent and pattern. By late that afternoon, the matter had been referred to the Columbus Police Department's Elder Abuse and Financial Crimes Unit. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Detective Renata Foster, a 19-year veteran who had built her entire later career around prosecuting exactly this kind of quiet, calculated cruelty against aging homeowners. Harold met with her personally that evening and walked her through the full sequence of events, the timeline of Peter and Caleb's deaths, the funeral ultimatum delivered in front of 40 witnesses, and the fraudulent guardianship petition filed less than a week after 2 funerals. Detective Foster pulled additional records that same night, confirming through Dr. Fenn's own expired licensing file that he had, in fact, never conducted a single documented home visit at my address at any point in the past 3 years. She also reached out to the court-appointed caseworker Patricia had seen photographing my house, a woman who had simply been fulfilling a routine assignment tied to the petition and had no idea the underlying medical documentation supporting it was entirely fabricated. That caseworker, once informed, immediately flagged the case as compromised and withdrew her preliminary report pending investigation. Detective Foster told Harold that between the expired medical license, the fabricated evaluation timeline, and Peter's letter establishing months of documented concern, she had more than enough evidence to move forward. She also mentioned discovering that Denise had, that same week, quietly contacted a realtor about future listing potential for a property on Maple Crest Drive, not realizing that particular conversation had been recorded as part of the realtor's standard consultation intake process, a detail that would later become significant. Every single thing Denise had rushed to arrange in the days following 2 funerals was now, piece by piece, working directly against her, exactly the way my son-in-law had quietly feared it might, and exactly the way he'd spent his final months trying to prepare me for. 9 days after the funeral, exactly as Detective Foster had arranged it, a Columbus police cruiser pulled into the driveway of a small rental property Denise had been staying at since I'd changed the locks on my own house the week before. Patricia told Gerald later that Denise answered the door in her housecoat, clearly caught off guard mid-morning. Detective Foster identified herself and informed Denise that she was investigating a formal complaint involving fraud upon a probate court and the submission of falsified medical documentation, along with an active inquiry into unauthorized use of a family member's identity on a financial application. According to Patricia, who had walked over that morning under the pretense of returning a casserole dish, Denise's face lost all its color, standing in that doorway. She tried explaining that Dr. Fenn had simply made a scheduling error regarding the visit date, but Detective Foster calmly informed her that Dr. Fenn's medical license had been expired for nearly a year, a fact that made the entire evaluation both fraudulent and inadmissible regardless of any scheduling confusion. Denise was brought in for formal questioning that same day, and within a week and a half, both she and Dr. Fenn faced formal charges. Denise, with fraud upon the court, attempted financial exploitation of an elderly individual, and forgery related to the earlier home equity application. And Dr. Then, with practicing under an expired license and submitting fraudulent medical documentation. The guardianship petition was dismissed immediately once the fraud came to light, and the probate court issued a formal order confirming my full legal competency and continued sole ownership of the property on Maple Crest Drive, precisely where it had always rightfully belonged. I moved back into my house on a cool Tuesday afternoon in late October, almost exactly 5 weeks after I'd walked out with one suitcase and a metal safe tucked under my arm. Gerald and Marion helped me carry a few boxes of belongings back through the front door, and Patricia brought over a pot roast that evening, the same kind of quiet, unglamorous, neighborly kindness that street had shown me my entire adult life. The house felt different without Peter's laugh in the hallway, and without the sound of Caleb's little sneakers thumping down the stairs two at a time. And it always will feel that way now. But it also felt like mine again, fully and completely, exactly the way it was always meant to feel. I found Caleb's little rain boots, still sitting by the back door where he'd left them the last time he stomped through puddles in my backyard, and I couldn't bring myself to move them. Not yet, maybe not ever. Denise eventually accepted a plea agreement on the fraud and forgery charges, avoiding the maximum sentence available to prosecutors, but still receiving 18 months of probation, a permanent criminal record, mandatory restitution for the borrowed funds, and a court order barring her from any future contact with me or involvement in my financial affairs. Susan, for her part, chose to step back from her mother-in-law entirely, a decision that broke something in her I don't think will ever fully heal, on top of a grief that was already unbearable. Denise never reached out to either of us again, and neither of us reached out to her. Some evenings I still sit in that same recliner in the living room, the same chair I was sitting in the day she knelt down beside me and gave me 30 days to leave the only home I've ever really known. And I think about Peter, and I think about Caleb, and I think about how a young father, even while quietly carrying his own private fears about his own mother, found a way to protect the rest of his family one final time before he ever knew for certain it would be needed. That envelope in my closet wasn't just paperwork sitting in a fireproof box. It was my son-in-law's last act of love for this family, prepared months in advance of a danger he could feel coming but couldn't yet prove. I lost my grandson, and I lost the son-in-law who loved my daughter the way every father hopes some young man will, and nothing in this world will ever fill either of those particular holes in my chest. But I got to keep the house where my daughter grew up, where my grandson learned to walk, and more than that, I got to keep the truth of exactly who Peter really was, right up until the very last thing he ever did for me. If this story meant something to you tonight, do an old man a favor and hit that like button. And if you're new here, stick around and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one still to come. Good night, everyone, and I'll see you next time.